Hi there, this is Helen Tarrant again from another here with our whole team. Wow, it's massive. Welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. You're here with Helen Tarrant, and I actually am interstate at the moment, but I wanted to share with you a snippet of a webinar I did yesterday about buying regional towns. And I think it's really, really important because most people don't recognize the risk when they're buying regional towns, and they end up paying more for it because they're looking from a Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane metro eyes. And what happens to that is that they end up spending and paying and overpaying, or they end up not trusting the right advice and overpaying for that property. So I want to show you the list of towns, and we did this, we had 160 people on the webinar. I want to show you the list of towns that I would consider the risk, and I want to show you where that sits and where you should be paying for the different types of properties in different parts of the regional Australia. And that goes across your major states, your Queensland, your New South Wales and Victoria. So it's definitely worth watching, especially when you're thinking of investing in regional, because right now is the time to be realistic. Right now is the time for you to really know that if you want to be in a large regional town, it's not going to be an 8%, it's not going to be a 7%, it's going to be a 6.5%. And you got to realize what your risk profile is and whether you can tolerate that or not. And if you can't tolerate that, you need to go back about 0.5% or 1% and be more in a metro area. And yes, you're not going to get the same returns. Yes, your yields are going to be less, but you get the security. And ultimately, don't chase and go and look for the unicorn. Build the unicorn out. So if you need to buy regional to get cash flow, then buy metro. Don't restrict yourself to a criteria so tight you can't find the property, because what will happen is everyone else will invest, you will miss the market, and you will regret it. So moving forward, I want you to watch this video and let's talk on the other side. I'm going to explain on the whiteboard how the different yields interplay, right? So what we're going to do is we've got yields.
Sorry, slight technicality. They couldn't see you.
Huh?
I forgot to press the button so they could see you. Sorry.
Oh, really? So we've got 4% yields to 14% yields, right? So that's the extreme of commercial property yields. You can go either way, right? We've got, 3%, 2%, 1%. We've got, probably things that will go 16%, depending on how far away you're willing to go, right? So typically we want to focus on as an investor that has got some risk appetite, and for a variety of balancing some growth with cash flow, etc., we tend to like to put it somewhere around potentially your 5.5% in metro, but let's just and we'll go all the way up to probably your 8%, right? That's sort of where potentially 8.5, depending on where, it depends on how extreme or where the client wants to go. Then what we want to do is then niche that in a little bit when we're talking about regional, and we're sort of talking here around 6.5%. So this is where the regional gap is when you are investing. You can invest on the other side, that is fine, but this is where we see your high risks are, right? This is where we see your low risks, and this is your medium risk area here, right? What we have here is this is a stable, what we find is this is a stable yield, a sustainable yield with growth added in, and the growth varies depending on which side. But this is the chunk that I want to talk about today and where you should sit, right? Because people don't really talk about it, and most people, when they don't know what they're looking for, are going to compare somewhere like a Townsville with a Bowen, right? Or somewhere that they might go, oh, Wagga is a great place. Why don't we go to Wagga and then we go to Warrnambool? Right? Well, they're totally two different properties, right? And two different property places. You can't compare them because they're two different towns. So when you are looking at regional towns, you've got to compare apples with apples. So things that we do look at is, firstly, we're going to look at something like demographics. We're going to look at yield, obviously it's important. And we're going to look at drivers in the economy. And we're going to go on any of the flow-on effects, right? We're going to look at tenant and security of the tenant. And also then we look at the property as well. So the yield leads to property, right? Right, so the property type and value, right? So this is where demographics, yield, property drivers, and tenant and security lies, right? And this is where we're going to go. So this is where I'm going to start listing out some different type of properties, different areas, and you're going to start seeing how that actually works when you're looking at the risk, right? So let's go 6.5, right? Let's go 6.5. So what does 6.5 now get you in this area? It gets you Townsville. It gets you Rockhampton. It gets you Bundaberg. It gets you Gympie. Right? It will get you into Wagga, which is, Wagga Wagga. It will get you into Albury, at Wodonga. It will get you into an area, it will get you into Warrnambool.
Gray's asking Armidale?
Yes, it will get you into Armidale, although at Armidale I actually prefer to go a little bit so, we can go to Armidale. Right. It will get you into, I'm just going back, definitely into areas like Sale and Gippsland in Victoria. It will be in, most of the time you're going to see fringe Adelaide. So quite outskirts, that's what we would call regional Adelaide area. Like Mount Gambier, you'll get you into Mount Gambier, definitely. Right. It won't get you into the ACT, it won't get you into sort of your Sydney, it won't even really get you into Port Macquarie or any of those things. Those are going to be over here on those lines here, okay? Obviously, so this is what the areas it will get you in. And you can see the demographics and everything starts. I mean, Gympie's a little bit less in population, but it has an onflowing effect of the Sunshine Coast. So it becomes more forms a part of the Sunshine Coast. But as a standalone, all of these towns actually have a large enough population on its own. So that's what they get you, right? And usually what you'll be looking for here is that your purchase price for that property is going to be somewhere around $1 million to probably 1.3 mil is going to get you something decent and value for money and freestanding. Anything less than that, very hard to come by, but it will be mostly strated office spaces, so freestanding buildings. So that's where the price point is, right? So let's then go to, okay, we drop that into a 7%, right? To 7.5%, right? So this is the areas that we go to. And then here, I'm going to go to your 8%, 8.5%, right? So let me quarantine that. So here we're at 7%. Well, what are we going to get? We're definitely going to be in, under tissue, there we go. I'm going to walk off. Tissue. I'd probably like to be. All right, so where does 7 get you? So that's a little bit further out. So you go to Charters Towers, which is outside of Townsville. Rocky, you're probably Blackwater. It's going to give you Blackwater there to there. Bundaberg, further out from Bundaberg, you probably need to go upwards in Bundaberg. So upwards in Bundaberg, you then in 2 hours you hit Gladstone. So probably Gladstone's down there. So Gympie, and then you've got sort of more inland. So I'll put inner Sunshine, and inner sort of Gold Coast. So when I'm being inner, I'm talking sort of areas. When I'm talking about, maybe Gold Coast, we're talking something like Tamborine. Looking at Tamborine Mountain. We're looking at areas of Sunshine like Penoma. So there's a few areas where it's sort of inland, sort of a bit isolated on its own. Wagga, we're sort of looking at the much smaller towns in between sort of Wagga and Albury. So we're looking at maybe areas like a town called June. They're very smaller towns in there. Albury Wodonga obviously is a larger town. Then we've got sort of much smaller towns like
Where the hell is June?
June. There's a chocolate factory in June. It's about a 45 minutes. It's between Albury and Wagga.
Right, nice.
Yep. So here.
Anybody who didn't know, there you go.
Yep. So here we might see a.
Are you talking about Junee with 2 E's?
Yes. Thank you.
Ah.
There you go. Wangaratta. Might see Wangaratta as Seymour, although Seymour.
Our Melbourne contingent was in. They got it sorted.
Ah, there you go. Although Seymour is probably more towards now 6% because it's come a long way. So Wangaratta, you will probably see you'll see Portland there on a 7 at the moment. Armadale, I probably prefer it to be more of a 7. And Tamworth.
All right.
Around that area, probably more 7 to 7.5. You've got your sales and more Gippslands and more here, but be careful when you buy into Gippslands. Lots and lots of lower socioeconomic people moving out of the area as well. You won't be able to be in Adelaide. You can still do Mount Gambier here.
All right, we've got a couple of questions. What about Logan?
Logan is part of Brisbane, so obviously it would be near the 5.5%.
All right.
Yeah.
Bathurst? No.
No, Bathurst is going to be 6. So Bathurst is a 6. So Bathurst would be here. So this is your, so your on-flowing. Look, you can occasionally get 6.5, depending on the tenant. So I will put it down here just in case. Lithgow is probably more likely to get it.
Yeah. And if you lock your keys in the car, just get someone for the prison and they'll get you back in. No problem. There's a massive prison in Lithgow.
Oh, here you could get, at the moment, you get Singleton.
Singleton, yes.
Singleton at 7, around 7.
Right.
Maitland is already at a 6.5.
All right. Oh my God, geez, we're going to go through every town in the country if we're not careful here, guys.
No, well, I'm just giving them examples, but you can find the characteristics of these towns and duplicate the characteristics of it, right? So the way that I look at towns and how they, is I take the New South Wales map and I overlay it in every other state and look at all the demographics and how it repeats itself, right? And demographics of similar towns behave the same. So if, for example, I'm comparing a property, right, and I got a 6.5 property, and I would compare a 6.5 property with Townsville, Rocky, and Bundy, right, and go, is that property the best we can do with that yield, with that tenant, when I compare those 3 towns together, right? If the answer is yes, then I'll say yes, do the deal here, here, there, and that's how I sort of when I look at the smaller towns, right? So here, when we're at the bigger sort of here, where you're sort of seeing things that are a lot smaller. You're seeing Ayr, you're seeing Innisfail, you're seeing actually Bowen's more like that's towards your 7, so that's where Bowen is sitting. You'll see Gladstone here. You should see Mackay here, but I have seen Mackay go in there as well, depending on the property. You should see Mackay here. You would see Emerald here. And guess what? I was stuck in a lift last week, and the people, I was always saying to myself, I haven't been to Emerald and I should really go and visit. The 3 people that were stuck with me in the lift are actually from Emerald. They actually came to Sydney for her 40th, and 2 of them were police officers, and the other guy owned a pub, the only pub in Emerald.
Well, there you go.
I was able to, while I was stuck there for half an hour, ask them all about Emerald.
Well done.
And now I've made friends, and when I go there, I can go to the pub for a free drink.
Oh,
and go and see the police officers, right? That's all I need.
Life sorted.
Life is sorted, right?
All right.
So these are some
you
of the
just be pleased to know Greg rates Lithgow. There's power stations and the Nutella factory.
Woohoo, Nutella factory.
Yummy.
Yeah. All right. So here, where you've got your Ayr, your Innisfail, your Gladstone, your Mackay, your Emerald. Look, there's really nothing there that's in the Victoria part that's going to sit in that 8 to 8.5 without really extreme risk, right, of that. Mount Gambier, you'll probably still be able to, depending how further out from Mount Gambier, because it stays quite on its own, you can probably still get towards your 8s, but you'll find that even at 8%, your risk starts to get into there. So with I guess we went through West Wyalong. West Wyalong will be around 8 to 8.5 now.
Oh, easy.
Yeah. So.
Oh, No, West Wyalong's actually lower than that.
Is it lower than
West
that?
Wyalong's probably 7.5 to 8.
Really?
Yeah, because one of the obscure things about West Wyalong is there are 3 big mines there. And as much as everybody freaks out about mines, they're owned by multinational companies and they're approved to at least 2032.
Okay.
So that's at least another 10 years that there's going to be the big mine in West Wyalong.
Yeah. Okay. So Narrandera, like we went to Narrandera, you're going to see Dysart here.
Dysart.
Yep. You're going to see.
I got to tell a story about Dysart.
Wait, no, you've already told that story several times. So just going through that for you're going to see Kudamundra. Kudamundra. Sorry, it's not spelled right. So Kudamundra, I think there's an N. They recently had a sale for one of their pharmacies for about 8%. It's a very small town. And then you've got quite a few towns on. If you look at the drive between Sydney to Melbourne, a lot of that small towns that are just by itself will be sitting somewhere at 7.5 to 8%. So that's sort of where it is. But if you look at where the demographics of these people are, they're very small towns and they're large mining towns, right? So you'll see a Karratha here. Karratha will be more. So Karrathas will be here. So that's your WA. Karratha will be here towards that Nile Plus area. Anything that's further into there, I would even be expecting parts of Dysart to be there, parts of Emerald to be in the 9%, depending on what you're looking at. So that sort of is when I look at the towns, these are the sort of the towns that are broken up. And look, how do we know? Through experience, through doing deals. We've done deals in almost I've seen deals in almost every single one of these towns we have listed here, right? So if you can imagine the range of experience and everything that we have in this area, then you know that, to get an accurate gauge of across the board is what it's hard to. And when you're looking at a property single-handedly, you got to, say for example, you get a property in Charters Towers, you've got to compare it with, a Tambourine, a Blackwater, a Wangaratta. Like that's how we would compare it. And go, is that worth it at that price range, right? So for something like that, you could get properties between 600 to 800k that are quite good quality, are that freestanding property, right? And that's where, because you're in a smaller town, the 800 to 600 to 800k actually gets really good value properties, right? And again, when you get to areas like that, I mean, of course, apart from you buying large industrial properties, which is multi-million dollars, which exists in any of these towns, we're talking about the average purchase, right? So in somewhere like Ayr and Innisfail, again, we're at that. I think that comfortability around that 600 to 800k gets you a lot of properties, right? So if you're looking at starting out and looking at something that is startup, that is where we're seeing most of the deals and the price points with each, where you still get good value. At the end of the day, it's the value for money proposition, right? And this is where you get the good value. And we did talk about the drivers, right? So one of the things you've got to ask yourself is actually the idea of risk, right? So that's the idea of risk. We talk about that, and how does that risk affect it? So whenever you go one step into regional, so let's say that this is where your medium risk is, and this is your metro area. And that's your Brisbane, Sunshine, Gold Coast area. Sydney's more here. You've got your Sydney, Melbourne here. And here, and this is sort of your Brisbane strip, right? Right, so let's say you do that, and any time you add into your regional, every time you add in a yield of extra 1%, you increase your rent. You should increase your risk by roughly, I think, on average, probably about 10%. But just in terms of your risk, it goes up one notch, right? So what does that mean? It means that you've got to account for a higher vacancy rate. You've got to account for a re-tenancy time frame. It's going to be different as well. So, for example, if we're in Metro in Sydney, it might be, say, 3 months to re-tenant, right? Here, it might be 3 months or 4 months to re-tenant. Sometimes it doesn't. It takes you 1 month or it takes you 2 months to re-tenant, but that's where we sort of goes. Here we're at towns or the regional areas here, we budget about 3 to 6 months, right? The 6 months is really important to be really realistic in terms of finding a tenant. And here, so here we would start out at, it's going to be 6 months minimum, right? Potentially 6 to 9 months. And here we're at 12 months. We're at 9 to 12 months. All right, so that's where your difference is. So that's your re-tenant. All right, so if you have a vacancy, 3 to 6 months is this area that you need to put in buffer. Anything else, you need to put 3 months up there. But as you go along the regional areas, as you get more and more yield, you are going to get more and more. You are actually going to put Perth here because you can get Perth somewhere here, between 6.5% to 7%, right? So you get your 3 to 6 months, and you get your 6 to 9 months here, and then you get to 9 to 12 months. That's where your vacancy level is, and that's what you should be budgeting for, right? So here you're budgeting 3 to 6 months in terms of putting enough buffer in place for in case you have emergency and you need to put the, something happened to tenant and you need to change over the tenant. Here it's about 6 to 9, here is 9 to 12, right? Especially when when we're looking at 14%, we're looking at high impact, so large format industrial in mining is your riskiest proposition or property, right? And that some can be 2 years, right? Here at the vacancy can be 2 years. Here where we're like ultra low risk, vacancy is like 1 month, if at all, right? So that's the difference, and that's where your risk level is and your risk appetite is, right? And it doesn't matter whether, in fact, there was a question about doctors, pubs, and childcare, all of this other stuff. In fact, the more you're in regional, the more higher risk you are buying a specialized asset, right? So this is where, when we then talk about asset types, right? So we add into this mix. And I know this now becomes complicated because you go, well, how do I know it's the right property? But that's exactly why you need to engage professional advice. But on top of that, we add in tenant types, right? So you add in the tenant.
And also, Helen, there's been a whole series of questions.
Yep.
But I think we'll go through this first and then we'll answer all the questions.
Yeah, well, I'll go back there and we can answer the question. So talk about the tenant, right? So the tenant that is the less specialized tenant, when you're regional, right? The less specialized the tenant you are, and this is really, really important, the less specialized your tenant you are, the better you will do out of the deal because it reduces your vacancy, right? So let's say you have a large warehouse, right? And the tenant has, it is a mechanics tenant or a trade tenant, but it can be changed from one mechanic to diesel to other things. It can be all sorts of type of tenant. You are going to do better with that property because it can be repurposed really easily. The more specialized that property is, pubs, childcare, medical centers, the harder it is to find a new tenant because in regional, there's probably in areas like this, there's probably 1 or 2 medical centers, 1 or 2 childcare centers, right? Over here, you'll get 6. And you'll get 7, right, or 10 pubs around, right, because there's a population, right? Think about Townsville with 185,000, Rocky with 90,000, Bundaberg roughly around the same, Albury with Donga combined almost 100k, right? There is a lot of pubs and a lot of doctors and things like that. But when you are in smaller towns, when you become vacant, it's very hard to entice someone to come into town or someone to occupy that space, and it costs a lot to repurpose, right? So that's where it is. So when you're a regional, we like to have more flexibility when we're looking at properties for you because we know that in the future, if you need to repurpose, it's going to be cheaper. In metro, though, because there is the demand, right? If one childcare provider leaves, another childcare provider will come in. If someone who's running the pub is not successful, someone else will come in. They can turn the pub around as long as there's demographics and people in demand. The specialized asset is actually not that bad. Actually, people prefer that specialized asset because they know it gives them a level of security. Whereas I feel in that looking at around and what regional towns are, you get a lot less security by buying specialized asset, but more security by buying non-specialized asset that are versatile, right? Whereas in metro, it's a little bit the reverse. So anything that you do in metro, you got to flip it on its head for regional, and you got to think differently. And one of the biggest mistakes people make when they invest in regional is they take their Sydney and Melbourne hats and Brisbane hats and go, all right, I'm going to look at it exactly the same when I invest in regional. And that's where the regional people have a good laugh at us and say, hey, you know what? No one around here will pay that much, but some sucker down south have just paid some absorbent amount for a property, right? And every person in town wants to cash out, and that's where we're seeing prices driven to really new highs, and this is where we're seeing people make mistakes in regional. Because the other thing happens is when regional corrects itself, it tends to stay flatline for a lot longer than metro does before it picks itself back up. So that, in a snapshot, is about investing in regional. And for most of you, you're going to have to rewatch that.
All right.
So, shall I go back and answer a whole stack of questions?
Yes.
Has that been helpful though? So, you've just watched the video on the different areas in commercial property. How does this trend to you? So, on $1 million, right? So, when you buy metro on $1 million, let's say your interest rate is about 3.5%, which is about to become 3.5%. We're still seeing interest rates somewhere between early threes, but it's about to become 3.5%. So, 3.5%, if you buy $1 million property and your net yield is 5.5%, it's going to give you $55,000 in net rentals. So what you take out of there is your $35,000 out of the million of interest for that, because you've got to account for how much your deposit's worth and how much to service your deposit and that debt in terms of your deposit. So it becomes, you times it by the full purchase cost of that $1 million. You get about $20,000 in net passive income after mortgage, after outgoing. Now, if you go to regional, like a Townsville, Rocky, Armidale, or areas like that, when you're getting 6.5%, what you'll find is that instead of getting $20,000, you're going to get $30,000 in passive income. Now, when you go one step further and you're getting your 7.5% yield, you're going to get $10,000 more. So every time you go up a bracket and you go further out regional, you can get $10,000 more on every $1 million investment. So think about that and the cash flow. But you're going to weigh it up. Is that $10,000 worth more than your risk, right? If you can't buffer, right? If I'm just telling you now, if you can't buffer and say that if you're regional and you become vacant, you're going to buffer 3 to 6 months. For you, that means you can't sleep at night. For you, that becomes a major issue. Then you need to go to metro areas and settle for a lesser return, right? It's risk versus reward, risk versus security, and you got to realize what you're prepared to do for that risk as well. And then on top of that, you got to think, okay, if I want to be getting extreme yields, we are going to be in extreme regional, where you are needing to buffer 9 to 12 months of vacancies, right? And for most people, that's really, really hard, because they can wipe out your cash flow in an instant, right? Especially if you have tenants that 2, 3, 5, or even 10 years. One year of vacancy can wipe it out or reduce the value of your property. Then you need to go back 1%. Every time you feel there is more risk than you can handle, go back half or 1%, then you're in a more comfort zone. However, there is a caveat. There is always an anomaly in everything that we do. So you will always see advertising for a property that is going to be 7.5% in Townsville, whereas normally 6.5%. So you got to ask yourself, why is that 7.5% rather than 6.5%? So don't always chase the yields. Look at other things and other factors. So for example, 7.5% yielding property in Townsville could be really high impact out of town industrial properties, right? Where it's not in town, it doesn't have that security, you get an extra level of risk. But also it could mean that it's a leaseback property, it's got a vacancy upstairs, or that the tenant has inflated rent. So that extra yield makes up for it. So you got to have a think about all these different factors when you're investing in commercial property, but also don't tighten it so much. And you got to be realistic right now in this market, because there are more buyers than sellers. So ultimately, there's always someone to pay more for the property. And that's what happens in commercial, where it's not driven by interest rate, it's driven by supply and demand. And whether you want to believe me or not, that's entirely up to you. But if you don't, you go out and do some research and you'll find how the market works. So if you do need someone to help you, someone to help you either define what the sale price of your property is if you've got a commercial property you want to sell. You want someone to help you buy commercial property with the right yields into the right town. You want someone to help you build out a commercial property portfolio, or you simply need some advice about what you should do to get into commercial property, then reach out to us. helentarrant.com. Go there, send me a message. Let's not jump on a strategy call. helen@commercialpropertycashflow.com.au. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.